Welcome to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast where we explore all things theology and therapy. I'm your host, Grace Brown, registered psychotherapist with Journey with Grace Counseling Services, also certified Canadian counselor.
And I'm Brad Watson, author and pastor of Nexus Church. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa. Welcome to another episode of The Sacred Sofa. Good to see you again, Grace. And I'm excited today because we have a very special guest with us. My colleague and friend Karla Drader is with us, and she is a pastor and spiritual director. So welcome, Karla.
Welcome, Karla.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Great to have you. Great to have you. So, Karla, how about you introduce yourself to our listeners and talk about your role as a spiritual director?
Yeah, so I'm a certified spiritual director and also an Enneagram practitioner with the narrative tradition, which I really appreciate. So I offer one-to-one and group spiritual direction, and I really appreciate spiritual direction for its ability to just really hold space for the spiritual elements in people's lives. So yeah, the relationship with God or a higher power, however you perceive that to be, there's room for that.
Welcome. And if people are interested in a bit more, because I know you're going to give us a quick summary of what the role of a spiritual director does, but where can people find more information or connect with you?
Yeah, I've got a website, so just karladrader.com. There's kind of more of an explanation about what spiritual direction is, a bit more of background on me, and yeah, a way to connect. So
Excellent.
karladrader.com, yeah.
karladrader.com. Fantastic. And maybe share a bit of a difference between what a spiritual director does and a therapist does.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of overlap because our spirituality and emotional health is very connected. So we do cover similar territories, but yes, as I said, the focus of spiritual direction is on those spiritual elements of your life. So we consider your image of God and really notice where the Holy Spirit might be moving in your life. So it's about learning to discern those patterns and see where your invitations are. So then therapy would deal more with your family of origin issues, emotional baggage, working on separating out what your emotional work is from what isn't. I came across this helpful image actually. So if you're a tree, therapy would be like looking at a spot on a leaf or addressing a broken branch. But then spiritual direction would be like focusing on the wind blowing through the leaves and branches. So how God is moving in all of the aspects of your life, including those broken pieces.
Wonderful. That's beautiful. Yeah. And we're excited to have you because Brad and I believe, and along with you, we're passionate about holistic well-being, which is largely why the Sacred Sofa came to be, is exploring those theological themes as well as those therapeutic themes. And so wonderful to have you as a guest today, Karla. So we're going to be talking about boundaries. Boundaries can be sort of a buzzword right now. So I thought it might be helpful to define a little bit about what do we mean by boundaries? And I'll give some examples. So boundaries are a way of creating lines or foundation or fences around what's important to us. In the same way, if you're living in a residence that has a fence, that fence will have multiple purposes, but it will also delineate what's your property versus your neighbor's property, or your property versus the city's property. Boundaries rule the world. A door is a boundary. We're socialized to understand when a door is closed. You knock before you enter. Our skin is a boundary. The good stuff stays in, the bad stuff stays out. If there's a tear in that skin, we got to address that, or other things will be impacted by that. So boundaries keep us safe. And so some people feel like boundaries can be about, imprisonment, but boundaries are actually about freedom, giving you an expansion of how you can live your life in a healthy way. A few months ago, we had this incredible galactic experience, the solar eclipse. Half the world and planet was talking about this. Well, in the realm of boundaries, imagine if that sun moved a millimeter out of its course, its boundary in the atmosphere, or the moon move out of its course, right? we would then have apocalypse or complete annihilation.
Mm.
And it's a little dramatic illustration, but the beauty of that experience as the sun crossed over, the moon crossed in front of the sun, we could enjoy that experience because both entities, stars, stayed inside their boundary. And so that's where we're going with, to explore boundaries in terms of relationship.
And I'm excited about that because this is, I think, an area that I'm not strong in. So this will be a great learning experience for me. So I wanted to jump in with you, Karla, because Karla gave a teaching around relational boundaries. And the first question she asked, I loved it, was how do you follow the Jesus path and not get taken advantage of? And I think it's such a poignant question. And so, Karla, I thought, maybe start with, where does that feeling come from? Is it something that maybe that question originated because you have been taken advantage of in the past? Like, where did that arrive from, this question?
Well, I'd already been thinking about boundaries, and then this question actually came out of an Ash Wednesday activity we did at Nexus, where we posed questions about life and faith. And this question was a response to being asked where life or faith felt confusing. And I was just immediately curious. And I guess I did resonate with it personally. I just think for so many of us, it's a big issue. So depending on our church background, many of us, and I think it's likely stronger for women, we've been taught that a true follower of Jesus is to live a life of service and sacrifice, which is true, but it can get really exaggerated and frankly is ripe for misuse, manipulation, even abuse. So just that pressure of feeling like everything is our responsibility and we can't say no to anyone without being selfish, that's pretty intense. And the funny thing is, it doesn't lead us to more compassion. And I think it really grabbed me because it's just so different from what I think Jesus demonstrates and asks of us.
So I'm intrigued about what you discovered in your research as you talked earlier, Karla, about the most compassionate people. Can you tell us about a common trait compassionate people have?
Right. So I actually looked at the research of Brené Brown. So over 8 years, she surveyed so many people, and this theme emerged that really shocked her, and it surprised me too. She found that the most actively compassionate people, the thing that they had in common was boundaries of steel. And I guess I had expected, like Brené, that it would be a strong spiritual belief, but this actually kind of makes sense.
That is, wow, that is kind of shocking to me. I'm curious about that. Okay, but Karla, as a spiritual director, as a pastor, why then, you've already touched on it, but why is it so important for us to establish boundaries? It sounds like it will help us be more compassionate, actually, but like, what is the spiritual benefit or imperative for us with setting boundaries?
I think there's like a lot of reasons. Besides putting the oxygen mask on ourselves first, which is a really important thing, it's making sure that we are resourced, since we are the ones actually who know best what we need at any given moment. Our bodies tell us, listening to our bodies will give us a clue. And then it's really about having a choice and freedom to actually be loving instead of just dutiful, which gets us pretty far, but it runs out. And it's about our identity as children of God, bearers of the divine image. We're worthy of love and care just like everyone else.
Yes.
So yeah, it's about discernment and bringing up that awareness of God's work in our life, right? And you can't give what you haven't truly received. You can't receive that without good boundaries.
Now, Grace, I'm sure as a psychotherapist, this is something that probably surfaces a lot with clients. Maybe they don't even identify their need for boundaries, but I'm sure it's something that comes up a lot. So could you maybe speak into it from a therapeutic lens? Like, how do you go about helping clients establish boundaries or even be aware that they need boundaries?
To your point, Karla, I do largely believe this is an issue for women. And I'm hoping we can spend some time in the future exploring boundaries according to gender. I think that's another episode, perhaps in the works. But in the work I do with clients, when they come in, they use words like exhausted, overwhelmed, feeling guilty, or they would talk about increasing irritability and anger. For me, that's always a strong indicator that a lack of boundaries or too loose of a boundary is at work. So then the next step is to help them understand what boundaries are, to help them realize that we all need them, and give them permission to start to create and then maintain them. I often work with clients and use the imagery of a fence, and this comes from some of the work of Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. Stuart Townsend, who wrote a book on boundaries, which was revolutionary for me. And I can happily say, as a recovered people pleaser, it was a really important resource for me. But they use this imagery of a fence. And so I'm going to do a little exercise with you and Karla, if that's okay.
Oh, okay.
So the idea is to imagine if your boundary were a fence, right? And we understand that fences have different purposes. There's a picket fence that has a particular purpose. A construction fence has a purpose, even the fences that we have in our residential areas. And so I invite my clients to describe their boundary as if it were a fence. And I'll go first. So my fence would look like a wooden fence, something you'd see in a residential backyard, probably medium height, 6 feet or so. There'll be a nice picturesque window in the middle of the gate there that you can see in, but it will have a latch. And so I can lock it and I can open it and I can give people access in and out of my fence.
Cool.
Okay, and do you want me to share?
Yeah,
Grace, I'm almost embarrassed because the first image that came to my mind was a barbed wire fence. And I don't know what that says about me, but
we'll talk about that. So barbed wire fence.
Barbed wire fence, kind of want to make it intimidating for people to try to get in. There's got to be a whole other episode unpack that. I think there's something there, maybe troubling, but that was the first image that came to mind for me.
Okay. And how about you, Karla?
You know, what I saw right away was like a wooden fence, but more like an old farmy kind of fence. So like there's quite a bit of space, maybe a little rickety. and yet I noticed like there's maybe, if I consider like certain relationships, there might be like a huge like cement structure, like it might be different, you know.
Absolutely. And this is part of the exercise we do, because the reality is our boundaries, our fences can change not only according to situations, but according to people. You know, and largely when I explore with different people, their fence is an indicator of the trust that has been breached often. So someone might have a low picket fence because not a whole lot has happened to them, but others have experienced enough hurt. They're like, look, concrete wall, barbed wire on top, the electricity.
You're gonna get zapped.
Zapped.
Well, and it really does depend, right, on what that person has done to you specifically with that relationship. Right?
So that's a really helpful imagery for people to say, okay. And it validates their experience too. It validates their experience. So that's kind of where we go in the initial working with boundaries.
Well, it's fascinating to me because I can see how both of those, this is where spiritual direction, I think, in therapy will be. I can see each of you having different tracks with that whole exercise and how that might play out. But that's a fantastic imagination exercise. I think it probably would yield a lot for whoever's going through it. But let's try to get right into the nitty-gritty here. I mean, I find this a very tricky area. So I've got 3, although I'll make every question probably 2 questions in one. But some questions for you both. I tend to worry, I'm guessing I'm not alone, the boundaries could become an excuse for me to be self-centered or selfish. And I get that there are times when it's necessary, good, virtuous to be uncomfortable in a relationship, right? Like, just because I'm comfortable doesn't always mean a boundary is needed. But how can we discern whether setting a boundary is being about healthy, taking care of ourselves, and when we might be using it as an excuse to maybe avoid hard conversations or that sort of the stuff? So maybe I can give you an example to help contextualize it. Good. So somebody that I find draining, just their presence is just, every time I talk to them, meet with them, I just feel drained, like they suck the life from me, you know, their company is taxing. I think maybe all of us can relate to someone in our lives like that.
Hmm.
Is there a place to say, okay, that's fine. Some relationships are draining. That's just life for you. But I'm going to try to be a friend to them. That's important. Maybe I just need to deal with that. Or is there a point where we say, okay, you know what? This is too much. This person's draining me. I have to find a way to put distance between them and I.
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
Karla, maybe you want to start here. I don't know. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, like I would immediately come with curiosity, like why is this draining? And then it's that discerning process. What is their issue? And it's like, that's not changing. I don't have control over that. What's ours? Sometimes we can address a wound in ourselves or a concern, like I'm scared about this happening. And then it can free us up to be more available. But yeah, it's like one of my online physical trainers says, you got to know when you're quitting on yourself first. So you might just say like, that's it, I'm out, that's too far, and kind of quit too soon. Because we don't want to seem unkind or selfish, but I have to tell you that in my experience personally and working with directees, that fear of being or appearing selfish can actually make us more self-focused. Because what we might call selfish is ourself trying to get our attention and to address things that need to be addressed. So we gotta be free to attend to these things, right? And boundaries give us that freedom to do what's right and needed, regardless of how we come across. And I love what Brene Brown says. She experienced this massive breakdown, I think partly because of poor boundaries. Before her breakdown, she was sweeter on the outside, but was more judgmental, resentful, and angry on the inside. So now she's way more serious about her boundaries. She's finding herself to be genuinely more compassionate, less judgmental, and resentful. So she isn't sure how that comes across to others, but she's not worried about that so much. And it feels pretty powerful to her, she says. So that the element of choice is so important. If you feel stuck in that relationship, how can you be compassionate and present? You're just going to be like, I have to get out of here. When you don't have the choice, it's duty and drudgery rather than joy and freedom.
I love that.
What about you, Grace?
Well, first, I'm going to say healthy boundaries are not selfish. And I often hear that fear from folks in therapy. And I actually invite them to look up the definition of selfish. Because we have this habit in the English language be saying words that we don't actually know what they mean, or they become, polluted over time. And so, selfish is to your focus on self to the exclusion of others. And most times folks who are struggling with boundaries, they're actually so other focused that they forget about themselves. So healthy boundaries are not selfish. Boundaries are for me, it's not for others. My own personal therapist who worked with me encouraged me years ago when I was developing the skill of necessary boundary work. And she said something that I often pass on as a gift to clients, the same way I received it as a gift. She said, Grace, you are responsible to verbalize your boundaries with love, care, and respect. You are not responsible for how they respond. And that was the light bulb moment for me. It's like, I got to speak my truth, right? And I'm going to do my very best to adhere to my values and being loving and caring, respectful. I can't worry about how they're going to respond, because if I'm so other focused, I'm going to dismiss my own needs. And then, as Karla mentioned, anger, bitterness, resentment will start to take hold. The responsibility to identify, create, and maintain the boundary is mine. We can't assume people know what and where my line is. Right? If I embrace Karla in this amazing hug, because I'm like, we are so vibing together, and she's in her mind thinking, no, thank you. Why are you touching me? But she doesn't say anything. The next time I see her and we're vibing again, what I'm going to do? I'm automatically going to reach in for an embrace. So it's her responsibility to say, you know what, Grace, I actually don't prefer that. Maybe a fist bump might be, more appropriate for us. And so it's not selfish to say what it is we need. And the reality is there are what I call boundary jumpers in the world, some of which may be people close to us.
Mhm.
Oh, that's
So,
good stuff. And you're starting to get into the tough stuff, right? Because just that example you mentioned there, right? It's like, now I have to say something uncomfortable that might make the other person feel
Yeah.
bad about their actions or whatever. So I mean, we're getting into the nitty-gritty here where it's like, ooh, okay, this is going to require some courage, it would seem.
yes.
Two-part question for you here, because I was reflecting on this theologically, and it struck me because Karla, you were mentioning Jesus' boundaries. And I think when you go reading through the Gospels, it's very clear that it's there. So many boundaries about personal time, recovery time, lots of boundaries that way. But I was struck by something this week. There are three stories in the Gospels that I think, for me, I've always read them. And I think, Jesus, you come across as a jerk here. Like maybe something's lost in translation. And I think that actually happens a lot. So, something's going on there. But as a reader and observer, there are times when you're like, Jesus, you look like a jerk. And there are three of them. The first one for me is when Jesus delays coming to Mary and Martha send word to him. Lazarus is about to die, come help. And he decides to sit around for 2 days. We don't really know why. Second time is Jesus' mother and brothers come. He's busy working, but they're asking for an audience. And it almost feels like it'd be one thing to be like, hey, not now. But he's like, who's my mother? Who's my brother? Like, like it's kind of, whoa, almost a disowning there. And then there's a bizarre one in Matthew 15 where a Canaanite woman asked for his help. And we know Jesus, of course, he felt his particular boundary and calling was to the people of Israel. His movement would move beyond that. But she comes to him with her daughter, I believe it is, her daughter is in need of healing. Jesus just ignores her and then says no, and then says, hey, this is the rude part. Hey, I'm not going to give my bread to the dogs. Now, she has a brilliant comeback with Jesus. Like it's just snap. And said, hey, even dogs eat the crumbs from their master's table. And so Jesus relents there. But those three stories have always rubbed me a bit the wrong way. And I think what struck me this week is reading them through a boundary lens. I couldn't help but think, oh my goodness, I think Jesus was just doing boundaries here. And it might come across as rude, but that to me suddenly struck me because so much of my fear is the example you just met, Grace. Someone maybe hugs me, I don't want to hug, and I have to be the one who says, hey, don't want that. I'll settle for a fist bump. That feels so rude. So I guess my question is, man, that takes a lot of courage. How do we deal with that? How do we come to peace with setting our boundaries might make people think we're rude?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to piggyback a little bit off of what Karla said. It starts with knowing ourselves first. What is mine? What is not mine? And Jesus spent a lot of time communing with God the Father to be very clear on what his mission was and his ministry was. And even though Jesus could come off looking like a jerk, it's because we don't actually know what the mission was, in some of these texts. When Jesus we don't know what and when Jesus was called to perform some of these miracles. Jesus was fully God and fully human. That's that mystery, right? Which means he had limited resources as a human. And in the story of Lazarus, Jesus, you can tell, is impacted with sorrow because of the loved ones that he was interacting with and their pain in the delay. We don't know what that was about. But he had a purpose, and his purpose had to be maintained inside of those boundaries. The way I interpret that family situation is a reminder and a caution that boundaries are necessary, sometimes even more so in family systems. Jesus' brother and mother wanted his ear as family, but just because we're family doesn't give us a pass in disrespecting our calling, Jesus's calling. And the Canaanite woman, that's a multi-layered one here, podcast after podcast to unpack some of these things. But I think Jesus was teaching not only about boundaries, but the inclusive message of the good news that he came to share and embody. A lot going on here.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think, Karla?
Well, yeah, I think like you, I wasn't sure how to read Jesus in these stories. I think as a kid, I filed it under his like, being kind of cold or unloving, but I attributed that to his ineffableness, serene holiness, like God, otherness, God knows. But like Grace said, like I wonder if it actually had to do with the limits of his humanity. Like he walked everywhere. We don't know that he teleported anywhere at all. He worked with his 24 hours a day. You know, people are theorizing, well, he probably knew that Lazarus was already dead, so there was no rush or like whatever. We don't really know. But ultimately, he doesn't seem too worried about how he comes across. He just does what he needs to do. And that's a huge challenge when we set boundaries.
It's interesting to me, though, because in the last example, I do think there's probably a playfulness going there that's maybe lost, but he actually breaks a boundary. So he makes it very clear, nope, I'm called to these particular people. And then it's almost like, wow, that was such a good answer. I'm breaking my boundary. Or I'm stretching my boundary, whatever it is, right? So then he responds to her and does what she asks. And I'm wondering about that. How do people set up boundaries so that not only do they help and protect us, but that they're not so rigid that, you know, what's the old saying? You know the rules, so you know how to break them, so to speak, right? You got to set up hard boundaries, but have that space to break them when needed. How do we discern around that?
So like in this specific example with this woman, some scholars consider that conversation as a learning experience for Jesus, which is potentially a shocking possibility for some of us, depending on how we see Jesus. But it could be that either this is dawning on him or that he's, you know, walking us through the expansion. But earlier in the gospel, like 5 chapters earlier, he actually tells his disciples, do not go any way leading to Gentiles. Do not enter any Samaritan town, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So it's like, here's the boundary. And then I'm just like, is it like he's looking at her and going, oh, you too? Like you're included too? He's having compassion, which moves his boundaries. And maybe that's what happens with us. Like, actually, there are more seats at the table than you think. Yes, that person's included too. Yes, go show love to that person. Because this whole thing that we're doing here is about growth and it's about compassion and love. So yeah, our boundaries need to serve us. So there'll be times when we need to loosen them. They do need to be flexible, but man, that's like a master ninja boundary level move. Flexible boundaries are so much more difficult than rigid ones. Keeps coming back to discernment.
I wanted to jump in quickly there, Karla, because I agree. For some people, that might sound shocking, but in Luke, right, we're told that Jesus learned and grew in wisdom, right? So it's not like Jesus arrives as this static, knows everything, like he is human. So there's
like
a
at first
development.
It was just him and his mom, and then it was like, oh, you're here too, Dad, and then it just grows.
Keep growing, yes. And so I don't think to say, oh, maybe he learned something there. I don't think that needs to shake our Christology, so to speak. That, oh, what does that mean? Does that mean he's not? But that's really interesting. Grace, you got a perspective on this? Like, how do we set boundaries that are able to be loosened occasionally or broken at the right time?
And I believe Jesus had such clear boundaries that he knew when to flex it. You know what I mean? And I think along with what we just said, he learning as well as those with him learning the healthy way to include and grow. Dr. Raquel Martin is a psychologist, and she can help with this concept around how do we keep our boundaries flexible. She says boundaries guide my behavior, rules guide others' behavior. And sometimes we get that mixed up and twisted. We were like, I don't want you to do these things because boundaries are about my behavior. So she gives an example. You need to stop yelling at me. Well, I can't control what someone else is going to do versus boundaries is saying, if you insist on yelling, I'm just not going to have this conversation with you. This is you moving your boundary accordingly to protect your peace. Going back to boundary jumpers, this concept, the only people who get upset when you set boundaries are the people who benefited you from having none. This is a quote from tinybuddha.com. In Jesus' day, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the boys, the disciples, Jesus' family, there's all these people clamoring for his attention, and the same can happen in our lives. So we got to pay attention. Is like, okay, why are you getting upset with something that I've defined as important to me? Might you be in the presence of a boundary jumper? It's important to understand that healthy boundaries are flexible, softer when possible, firmer, and then rigid as needed, just like the different heights of the fence that we talked about earlier. With new information, you can adjust your boundary accordingly.
I wonder with that, I know my wife Kristen is a teacher, and she likes to, the first week of class, establish really tight boundaries so that she can loosen them later. But if you start with loose boundaries beginning, it's a recipe for trouble, right? And I wonder if there's something there, like, yes, we see Jesus break a boundary here, but maybe that's not the wise place to start for a lot of us. Going, no, you got to firm up those boundaries before you'll know when to break them. I wonder if there's something about, don't try to skip the process of establishing boundaries until you've got them pretty firmly in place.
I like that.
I think, yeah, and we kind of want to be further along spiritually, emotionally than we actually are. Like, we want to be loving.
True.
You know what? This just keeps reminding me of the one scene in Les Miserables where the bishop puts Jean Valjean up for the night, and Valjean ends up stealing his silverware, and he gets caught by the police. They bring him back to the bishop, and it's like, hey, you forgot the candlesticks too.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like the bishop is like completely, giving sacrificially, and we sort of picture that we want to be that kind of compassionate, and there's a place for that. But if people are just constantly taking our silverware, we're not going to have any to give, right? So he had the power to choose. Like, if he had been, held at gunpoint and said, like, you have to give me your silverware, in this case, he had the freedom to show mercy, and then it was merciful, truly.
Absolutely.
So what about where, I think because that's a beautiful scene in Les Mis, right? And but you're right. We often assume that we've done the work to get where the priest is, right? And it's like, well, that's probably formed over a lifetime. But what about relationships that already feel easy? Like, do we only form boundaries for those difficult ones, or is there a place to say, you know what, I need to establish boundaries even where it feels easy? Is that something we need to consider as well?
All relationships require boundaries. All caps, if I could say it that way. And it's highly possible that either these easy relationships are because folks aren't actually being vulnerable and sharing deeper parts of themselves, right? When I work with couples who there's no fighting, is the real person showing up yet? Right? Because Gottman says conflict is inevitable, combat is optional. When we're showing our deeper selves, we're going to rub up against some things that we might not appreciate, and that requires discussion and compassion and so on and so forth. You ask your question, are these easy relationships because boundaries have already been established and are being respected? If this is a long-term friendship or relationship, you kind of know where each other's line is, and you're being respectful of that. So that can make the relationship easy as well. What are your thoughts, Karla?
Yeah, I think just completely aligned there. Like, they're probably not a boundary jumper. Like, it could be also that, right? Where they're respectful, or they've shown you that, when you do say, hey, that hurt my feelings, or hey, what's that all about, man? I don't know, is that how you talk? then they show you that it's okay. Like, the relationship didn't end, everything's fine. Like, maybe it made your relationship stronger. So your relationship can tolerate that kind of back and forth.
I wish we could add that to the lexicon. I always think of Seinfeldisms, right? The close talker, the whatnot. I wish we could get boundary jumper into the lexicon. Like, look out, there's a boundary jumper there.
You have my permission.
Yes, I like
helpful.
I like
love
it.
That.
We are about out of time here, and I tell you, we got to come back to this because there's so many other questions swirling in my head. I wanted to talk about technology and how we set up boundaries around that, because I was just reflecting, Grace, your email has like office closed, autoresponder, and I think that's great. But what about texting? What about anyway? There's so many other areas we could go to, so it sounds like we're going to need a part 2 around this in the near future.
We would love to have you back, Karla, to talk about a lot more about boundaries and boundaries in relationships.
I would love that. You let me know.
Excellent. Will do. Well, thanks for your time, Karla. Thank you, Grace. As always, it's been great spending time with you both.
Thanks, Brad. And I want to say a special thanks to our listeners for joining us with The Sacred Sofa. We'll see you next time.